Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Good morning. I'm excited to be joined today by Aden Magee to discuss his latest book, The Cold War Wilderness of Mirrors, Counterintelligence and the Soviet Military Liaison Missions, 1947 to 1990. Aden brings a practitioner scholar perspective to the subject, having served as an Army intelligence and counterintelligence officers at levels ranging from the battalion to the combatant command level. During his 22 years of service, Aden experienced the waning years of the Cold War, the post-Cold War 1990s, and the early years of the post-9/11 period. Aden has continued his service since retiring in 2005 by serving as an advisor to the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and the FBI. In addition to his practitioner experience, Aden has authored multiple books and articles related to intelligence, counterintelligence, and operations. Aden, it's great to have you with us today. Welcome to ThinkJSOU.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be with you as well.
So, I'm always interested in what draws someone to a particular topic, and also the process they go through to research that topic. Can you speak a little bit about what drew you to this topic in your research process?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about the process that I kind of went through for the book, but up front, I just want to say that I'm not here to sell books. We're going to talk about the book, but you're a fellow author. You know that we don't get rich by off of these books, otherwise we'd die poor men. But we write them to give knowledge to other people. So even though we're going to talk about it from the context of the book, I don't, that's what we're here to talk about. But yeah, as you mentioned, I had the opportunity to command a pretty elite counterintelligence element during the last years of the Cold War, from 85 to 90. And one of my targets was the Soviet Military Liaison Mission in Frankfurt, one of my many targets. So I knew that I had a story to tell, and I knew that if I didn't tell the story, it was going to die in human memory. So I started to go through the process of just wanting to tell my story from that era of the Cold War. And as I started to put pen to paper, go through the process of getting documents declassified so I could actually tell the story, I realized that to get to that point in 1985 with the Soviet Military Liaison Mission Frankfurt, I couldn't just start right there. I had to go back and talk about the history because there were so many touch points that applied to what was going on during that time that I had to do that. So I went back and pulled together the history of the MLMs. And that's why the book kind of starts with that first section, kind of the long drawn out history, but everything that's in there really does apply to the entire story. And I'm not a historian per se, but I am a enthusiast of everything that's spy, counter-spy, intrigue. And as I was putting together that portion of the history of the MLMs, I realized that, hey, there is this larger strategic context that was going around in the world that they fit into very well as far as how the Soviets were doing business, what we refer to as this, the counterintelligence wilderness of mirrors. So I knew that once again, to get to the part of the story that I was going to be able to tell, that I wanted to tell, we had to talk about this strategic context and how the larger world was playing out and how the MLMs fit in and how the operations that I was managing fit in. So we had to kind of get through that part before I could get to the third part of the book, was to actually tell the story, which reads, kind of more like a spy novel than it does a history book, because that is the actual. So it's kind of a, I call it a walk, run, sprint is the way the book is kind of broken out. But, and I think that, the things that we'll talk about today probably are more in line with that middle section of the book, because that's, kind of the global construct that I think we're looking at once again today. And certainly when I started writing the book, it wasn't my intent. I don't think the term great power competition had even been used by that time. But by the time that I finished the book, I realized that, the last great power competition that we were engaged in was the Cold War. So if we don't we have to assume that there are some lessons that we can take from that great power competition and apply to the one or two or three that we're currently engaged in.
No, thanks, and that's something that I want to touch on later is the relevance and the value of history to think about contemporary times and stuff that we're facing. But what I really found interesting about your book, and you alluded to this, not being a historian, but finding yourself having to do some history research, there's really a gap in the scholarship on the story of USMLM. To be honest, I was largely ignorant of the organization myself until I was doing my own research on another topic. And I ended up interviewing Major General Roland LaJoie, who was a former commander, and I kind of got interested and intrigued by the organization. In my mind, it was kind of it has an interesting origin story that kind of led me to think about espionage in the open kind of stuff. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that origin story, give a little bit of the historical details on how and why the organization was founded.
Yeah, certainly. And imagine my disappointment when I realized that I needed to research that topic, and I was to find that there really was not a treatment that really went into great detail with that. So I found myself having to do that part of the project as well. But this is kind of the drier portion of the cast today. So I'm going to try to push through it very quickly. At the end of the session, we're going to show a link to a longer lecture that I did for the Army Heritage Center Foundation. So if anybody's really interested in getting into the deep history of it, that'll give them the opportunity. But I'll just hit on the high points of the history of the MLMs. And to do so, we have to go all the way back to the end, of course, of World War II. And as we were coming to the end of the World War II, the four allies, the French, the British, the Soviets, and the US came together to build a plan for how they were going to occupy Germany after the unconditional surrender. So what they agreed to, and if we could throw up the graphic, what they agreed to was to divide Germany into four sectors of occupation, and each of the Allied powers would occupy those sectors with their armies, and then they would work together to rebuild Germany. So just to get a little bit ahead of ourselves, I just want to note from the graphic that we have there, if you look to the east where you have the Soviet sector, that is what later became East Germany. And if you look at the three Allied sectors, the British, French, and US, that's what we eventually unified to bring together as West Germany, even when it was established as a sovereign country of West Germany, the Allied powers still continued to occupy with their armies with the Reconstruction. We'll keep the graphic here just for a minute, but immediately after the war, even though we had a plan for how we were going to work together to reconstitute Germany, the Soviets were already on their own agenda. They were placing communist members in the top levels of government within their sector of West Germany, and all the accords basically broke down, except there had been one provision in the primary accord that said that each of the occupying forces would establish a liaison mission with each of their respective headquarters. As the situation was starting to deteriorate, all the four powers agreed that, yeah, it's probably in our best interest to establish a military liaison mission so that we have open channels of communication there, so there's no strategic, any problems in that regard. And so the MLMs were established. Each of the Allies had separate agreements with the Soviets. The U.S. agreement was called the Eubner-Malinin Agreement, and we agreed to put a military liaison mission in Potsdam, East Germany, which is essentially Berlin, and the Soviets would have a Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt. And so what you had, and then for the purposes of this graphic, you had the three Allied missions that were in the Soviet sector, and then you had one Soviet mission in each of the three Allied sectors. Okay, we can bring down the graphic now. So the US and the Russians agreed that we would have missions with 14 people. They would have 10 vehicles accredited to each other, and that's the way it would be. And there was one provision in the agreement that basically said the MLMs would have freedom of movement throughout the other sector, except for locations with major military dispositions. But since that major military disposition was never further defined, all sides took that as a license to spy, and they began traveling throughout the area, collecting on each other's military. And these were referred to in the term of art as tours. They didn't call them collection missions. They referred to them as tours, and the officers were tour officers, and the NCOs were tour NCOs. And this is basically how we did business. In 1951, finally, the Soviets issued a map that had shaded areas, which were restricted areas, which said these are the locations that you cannot go to collect. Also, there were other cooperative norms, competitive norms that were developed. One was that each side would be authorized to detain another side's vehicle if they thought that it was in a location where it was near sensitive military. And basically that was done by 2 or 3 vehicles blocking the vehicle in and stopping it. So that's kind of the rules of the game that were established and pretty well continued for the next 42 years of the Cold War. There was one major difference between the two sides, and that was that the U.S. side established its primary base in West Berlin and began operating out of West Berlin and just used the Potsdam House as kind of a ceremonial site. And what this enabled them to do was to rotate in tour officers, to rotate in vehicles. And so they grew to this massive element of 70 people, and they became an intelligence collection machine. They were running 3 to 4 tours at a time, 24/7 operations, and they became the second most prolific DoD intelligence collector, probably the U.S. government, second only to the National Security Agency. So they were producing thousands of IRs every year. So they were an intelligence collection machine. The Soviets, on the other hand, they could have set up kind of the same arrangement by establishing a base on the East German border, but they chose not to do that. They were content with their 14 guys living on their island in Frankfurt, 222 miles away from the group of Soviet forces, Germany. So there was a pretty different dynamic. Now, granted, the collection environment in East Germany was a lot different than West Germany, because East Germany, that was just one big maneuver area, 20 Soviet divisions, 6 German divisions, whereas in West Germany, we kind of respected their sovereignty, and we did most of our training on military training facilities like Hohenfels and Grafenwehr. So the collection opportunities were a little different there. But again, the game of cat and mouse played out differently. But since the US MLM was so much more aggressive in their collection, the Soviets and the East Germans were a little more aggressive in how they combated the MLMs. Now, if we could bring up the next graphic, I just want to kind of throw this graphic up for a little perspective so people can kind of get in their head what we're talking about here. These are the US MLM vehicles. To kind of give you an idea, they were ruggedized for all terrain, because basically what they would do is go off-road, cross country, night vision devices, IR lights, go up on the target and collect on their target. So that's kind of the way they did business. So I just want to show these pictures for a little perspective. There you see the map. There is what the Soviets issued for. Those were the restricted areas that the US MLM couldn't go into. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of perspective. But since the US MLM was a little more aggressive and the Soviets were more aggressive in their defenses, they had incidents on their side that we never experienced in the US sector, and that included vehicle rammings and shooting incidents. And these continue to occur on a very regular basis. And so you could say that since we continued to allow them to occur without making them a deal breaker, breaking the treaty, then they were kind of normalized under international law as acceptable practices. And so let's go to the next graphic, please. So this is just some examples, and unfortunately, they continued to allow these things to occur. And the first fatality for a MLM member was in 1984. You can see the wrecked vehicle there. It was a French MLM member, a warrant officer, who was killed when it was rammed by an East German gas truck. At the time, the French didn't have diplomatic relations with the East Germans, so there wasn't a whole lot they could do other than either close down their mission or continue to operate, and they chose to accept the continued risk and continue to operate. The picture here on the left is Major Arthur Nicholson. This is when he was being detained by the Soviets in 1984, but the following year, in 1985, he was shot and killed by a lone Russian sentry. There was a negotiation that took place afterwards to make sure that it never happened again. They agreed to continue business as usual, and the shooting incidents and the rammings continued as usual. So and then the missions continued to operate until the day before German reunification day of October 2nd, 1990. So that's kind of in a nutshell the history of the MLMs. But we will say what kind of made them unique was that from the initial accords where the Allies agreed to reunify Germany, and this is something that the West Germans really held on to throughout the Cold War, that the international community was behind them eventually reunifying. The MLMs were the only provision of that accord that survived through the entirety of the Cold War. So that kind of remained the symbol of here's still the intent to reunify Germany as long as these MLMs continue to operate.
Hey, thanks, Aden. I wanted to touch upon, a little more of the strategic context that we had talked about, and looking at it from the title of your book. And so in a positive way, and this isn't a critique, but in a positive way, your title of the book, at least the subtitle, is a little misleading, because it's really a story broader than counterintelligence at this time. I was hoping you could comment a little bit of that, and then also what is meant by the wilderness of mirrors.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I can tell you there was some back and forth with publishers on this, but I don't think we could have, if we properly titled it, I'm not sure we could have fit the title on the cover. But the wilderness of mirrors, again, this is something that I really picked up on as I was reading the book. It's something that I was familiar with. My intent at the beginning was not to bring it in, but the wilderness of mirrors is basically the Soviet way of doing business during the Cold War. And it was the phrase was coined by the iconic director of CI for the CIA, James Jesus Angleton, and he was the chief of CI during the very formative Cold War decades of 1954 to 1974. And he looked at the Soviet way of doing business very aptly as it was a wilderness of mirrors. And if you kind of think about the house of mirrors, you don't know when you're looking in a mirror, you don't actually know if you're looking at the person or if you're looking at the reflection in the mirror. And if you add another mirror, then you have multiple people and you don't know which of those three are so that was kind of his concept. And the Soviets would continuously add mirrors to confuse and deflect the U.S. intelligence service. And so when we think of intelligence operations, we think of recruiting spies and gaining intelligence from them. But from the Soviet perspective, they would use their assets inside U.S. intelligence agencies, not only to collect information, but also to provide deceptive information to misdirect us from their assets, to make us, waste our time. And I've got some good examples of that. And, so probably one of the best examples, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do provide this as a class in another series, is that of Aldrich Ames. I believe everybody knows Aldrich Ames, the CIA spy that provided all of the top agents to the KGB, and they were immediately arrested and executed. So Ames was not a bright guy, was not smart. The KGB didn't handle his situation smartly because Gorbachev demanded that they all be arrested and terminated. So the CIA knew very early on that they had a very damaging mole within the ranks, and the KGB launched an operation which kept the investigation into what they knew was a mole in the CIA moving in very different directions, providing information through a double agent that pushed them in this direction. And then as soon as it looked like they were heading in the right direction, a communications intercept and things like that. So that was kind of the wilderness of mirrors, where you don't know if the information you're receiving is true or whether the information that you're receiving is false. And even though the CIA knew that they had a very high-level mole in their organization, the KGB was able to keep them going in different directions. And it was only 8 or 9 years later when he was finally discovered and arrested. So a very effective operation from that standpoint. But previous to that, during the Angleton era, his paranoia about the Soviet way of doing business basically forced him to shut down counterintelligence and intelligence operations for almost a two-decade period. And that's kind of a dark period in the history of the CIA, because he was so certain that the CIA was penetrated, he didn't know who he could trust. So he decided to just trust nobody. And in doing so, he compromised a number of agents, KGB, GRU, that lost their lives. So very quickly, the other intelligence service knew that cooperating with the U.S. was not a good idea. It was a death wish. So that really had a negative impact on CI during that period, which really cascaded down into DOD and other CI elements as well.
Hey, thanks, Aden. fascinating story, you bringing in Angleton. This, what I'd like to do is kind of bring it up a little bit and talk a little bit about the different approaches and how CI was used during the Cold War in the Soviet-US competition and the differences between the two countries' approaches.
Yeah, so the difference between the two approaches is kind of how a free and open and democratic society that thinks that there is a sense of normalcy somewhere operates against a very centrally orchestrated, autocratic, and sometimes ruthless organization that doesn't believe there's ever a sense of normalcy. And so that's kind of how the fight in the Cold War began between the two, was the Soviets had a very specific strategy coming in. CI for the US was very immature, nascent. We thought we were just going to clean up Germany and then leave. So they had kind of the long view of things, and CI was just kind of figuring out what it was going to do as we went through. And it kind of matured, as you would expect, that type of a dynamic. CI in Europe at the time, it was a ground force operation. So Army CI was the primary counterintelligence force there. Now there was Air Force OSI and NCIS, but primarily we're talking Army counterintelligence that was there. And back in that day, they operated on a regional support basis. There were 7 to 9 different regions in the area, and there was only a administrative headquarters. There wasn't a command and control headquarters of CI professionals who kind of orchestrated things across the theater, and much less globally. So basically, you just had these regional CI support elements in their own fiefdoms, and they were just responsive to the local commander or commanders in the area. And the intelligence officers that they worked for were generally tactical combat intelligence officers that didn't know a whole lot about CI. So as you would expect, CI was not terribly effective against the major threats of the time. And it wasn't, in fact, it wasn't until 1977 when the Army Intelligence and Security Command, as we know INSCOM today, stood up and finally brought counterintelligence under a centralized command and control, where we now did have professional CI and intelligence leaders managing operations. And after that point, towards the turn of the decade in the 80s, you saw a exponential improvement in counterintelligence, DoD counterintelligence capability when they did finally come around. But that was after a almost 30-year period of really ineffectiveness. And so what did that gain us? Well, in 1985, we arrested John Walker and found out that for the last 20 years, his ring had been giving decipher equipment and codes that allowed the Soviets to intercept and decrypt millions of DoD transmissions globally. In 1988, we arrested Clyde Conrad and found out that his ring for the last nearly 20 years had provided all of the Army, the USAR, and NATO war plans to the Soviets. Even one of the war plans he got $50,000 or $500,000 for. And so, when you're given that type of an advantage to the enemy, if they have all your war plans with all your go to war locations, where the tactical nukes are going to be released to a user level. He also compromised top secret cosmic nuclear code type of activity. The German judge who sentenced him to life in prison said that based on the information that he provided alone to the Soviets, had there been a war, the NATO would have immediately been forced to either culminate, or West Germany would have been a nuclear wasteland. So that's the kind of information that one spy gave away. And I'll keep going. There's James Hall, who was also arrested in 1988. He had a very relatively small period of espionage, but the programs that he compromised were incredible. One of them was the Trojan project. And that was, back in the day, the Soviets had a overwhelming armor capability in comparison to NATO. So Trojan was the project by which we would be able to identify large Soviet formations based on their communications signals and then take out those formations before they got into range. So that was a capability that the US was depending on to be effective if there was a battle during the Cold War. And the Soviets were aware of this capability, and they had taken measures to counter this capability, and we didn't know about it. And then there's finally, George Trofimov. He wasn't discovered until well after the Cold War, but he provided every bit of information that we knew of Soviet capabilities, Soviet equipment, Soviet organization. So of course, if they know everything that we know about them, what does that tell us? They know what we don't know about them as well. So, so that information alone going to the Soviets shows that the potentially catastrophic, results of a poor counterintelligence program during those formative years. And what's really kind of upsetting, I guess, is that since the Cold War, when we were finally realizing this, was next thing you know, the wall comes down, the war's over, we won, it's time to, cash in the peace dividend. I don't think that we ever really grasped what kind of a bad state of affairs we were in, because we so poorly fought in that gray area during those 30 years and let the Soviets have that type of a military advantage that we never understood that they even had until it was, almost too late.
You mentioned the professionalization. I think you said the centralization of Army CI and how it evolved over time. What was the interagency CI relationship during this period?
Okay, so I know I'm talking to an expert on the topic, so I'm going to be careful here, but it was not good. So as you're aware, the 1947 National Security Act put the CIA in charge of intelligence activities, made the director of the CIA or the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, the senior advisor to the president, the one who would advise Congress on budget and all of those type of things. And so ostensibly the CIA was kind of in charge of things. But as we all know from US bureaucracies, the interagency is constantly fighting with each other for budgets, which makes them not always want to cooperate. And the DoD dynamic with the CIA back in that day was what you would expect. In the day, whoever had the money had the power, and the DoD had the money and the power, and they were never an organization to allow another agency to manage their intelligence operations. They would never want to be beholden on the CIA to support their intelligence operations. So by the 1960s, the DoD owned 3 of the 4 largest intelligence agencies, in the National Security Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, they're the ones that put satellites up in the sky, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And also within the services, they had massive intel organizations, they had intel staffs. So their intel capability really dwarfed the CIA. So the CIA had really no power over them, except they did maintain primacy in 2 distinct disciplines: counterintelligence and human intelligence, or HUMINT. And so you would almost have thought that the CIA were kind of punishing the DoD CI program for what the DoD was doing to them in these other technical program areas. So there was really not a good relationship during those formative years that you would have liked to have seen. And for example, the CIA had kind of a Ivy League elitist mentality, and they kind of saw the DoD guys, the Army CI guys, they're generally non-college graduate in CI agents. They were, 21, 22-year-old kids in their perspective. So there was always this kind of younger brother kind of relationship that existed, rather than a partner type relationship that you would have expected to build. And this really was, we talked about that 30 years of bad times for Army CI, and it really continued for about that time. And it wasn't until Army and DoD CI started to develop, they got frustrated with CIA for not supporting some of their activities. They just started to develop their own capabilities that were really starting to see success in some counterintelligence and intelligence operations in the CIA. That's when they really started wanting to partner on things, when we were starting to realize some successes that they were not able to. And I'll just give you one, I'll fall back on the previous conversation that we had, is as far as the relationship goes, and I'm hoping you're going to tell me it's a lot better today, but the CIA had a source in the GRU who was reporting that the Soviets were receiving USAR and NATO war plans as early as 1979, and saying that they had been receiving them back as early as 72. And for whatever reason, it's never been explained, they never informed the DoD of this until 1985. So there was this time when they knew that we had this significant compromise, Nobody knows what they were doing, but we do know that finally somebody came into the CIA with the wherewithal to say, hey, we got to get this information to the guys that are being hurt. And so when they finally provided the lead that led to the arrest of Conrad, the Army was able to do a full scale, and this was probably the zenith of counterintelligence during the Cold War, the most effective operation and investigation ever conducted, in my humble opinion. But that gives you an idea of the lack of cooperation and the lack of the CIA in a lot of cases just not wanting to pull back the purple curtain and provide the information.
No, from my perspective, I think the relationship has improved, and I tend to be a little lenient on the institutions and organizations because they get focused on their own mission and purpose, and a lot of times I think it's just views the environment differently, different perspectives, and so it's not intentionally ignoring the partnership or not supporting. It's just a different perspective on the relationship and each other's mission.
And I agree.
So I'm a little more forgiving.
Yeah, and I'm looking at it from one's perspective, granted a parochial perspective, and I've got a little scar tissue that I'm probably feeling right now, and which kind of influences what I have to say. But I agree, and I did operate with the CIA certainly post Cold War, Kosovo, other operations, and yeah, things went much better than my earlier experiences.
You have a great quote that I want to read in length from the book and then lead into a question. You said, when the Cold War ended, the U.S. once again cashed in the peace dividend and gutted the national CI enterprise based on the perception of a diminished threat, opening the door to the next series of threats being China and a resurgent Russia. Can you discuss the closing of the U.S. MLM and what you meant opening the door to the next series of threats?
Yeah, so let me take it back just a step, because we did say to the next one. So let's bring us back to the first one, which was the end of World War II. And again, that's where we ceded the strategic initiative to the enemy. I mean, that's when we were hoping that the war was over. We were going to be able to bring it back to a sense of normalcy, but we didn't understand that we were dealing with one or two adversaries that didn't believe there was any such thing as normalcy. And it's kind of, we have to look at our own perspective of war, Revolutionary War, Civil War, Vietnam. We've never had to fight an existential battle. So when, we have that perspective of war, but when you look at the Soviets, dating back to the 1200s and the Mongols and the Ottoman Empire, then the French in the 1800s, the Germans in the 1900s, by the time they got to the end of World War II, this is a country that time and again, they were just invaded and ravaged by other empires. So at the end of World War II, what they were doing was looking around and saying, what is that next empire that's going to invade us and try to ravage our people? Great human loss. And so their perspective from the very beginning was, we're not going to ever let this happen again. There will be no more blitzkriegs again. And so we're going to identify who the enemy is, and we're going to take it to the enemy before we give them the opportunity to take it to us. And so that was their perspective. And so that's the way they were fighting in the gray space all those years, when we were just thinking we're just going to try to bring Germany back to a sense of normalcy and then leave. And also, keep in mind that during that, during that same period, the China was the central kingdom from the beginning of time, and that's how they viewed themselves. Then when they were defeated by the French and the British in the Opium Wars in 1839, that began what they called their century of shame. And so it wasn't until after the Communist Revolution that they came out of that century of shame, and their focus then became, we're going to reestablish. So what they've been doing for the last 70 years is wanting to reestablish themselves as that central kingdom. And that's why Xi is going to be elected dictator for life, because he's done so much in the last 20 years to bring China to that, now they're the pacing threat for us. So that signifies that China has finally reestablished itself as that central kingdom. And, so it doesn't look like they're going to stop there. So they are, again, wanting to place themselves where they are the predominant element in the world. So that's kind of, we got to kind of understand how our competitors are thinking. And we're always looking for the next, period of normalcy, but we got to look at it from the perspective of our adversaries never consider any period a period of normalcy. They are always fighting in the gray area, and unless we choose to engage in those areas as well, then we're going to find ourselves in the same positions in a lot of regards that we found ourselves during the Cold War.
No, I agree, and I think it's very important, for practitioners, something you mentioned, and I kind of align it with empathy. Be not sympathetic to your competitors, but be empathetic to your competitors. Understand how their view of the world has been shaped by their history and why they see things like they do. I think all too often we make this false dichotomy between good and bad, and the world is much more complicated than that. And so I agree with your point. It's important for practitioners to understand why our competitors, adversaries, however we want to frame it, views the world in which they do.
Agreed.
It seems to me that part of your story is about how organizations respond and adapt to the strategic environment. You've nicely talked about 1947, how the CI and the organizations, how the U.S. responded to Russia. You mentioned the peace dividend in the 1990s. Are there any lessons for today as we're in another transition point after 20 years of GWAT, of global war on terror, of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? Is there anything that from your research that we could pull out as lessons for today?
Well, I think I've hit on some of the harmful lessons, the issues of if we ignore some things, how it's going to come back to hurt us. But I think one of the key lessons that or issues that I would look at if we look at it from the standpoint of the military liaison missions is, obviously to different degrees, but they exploited their access for intelligence collection purposes. And I think that anytime as we're looking at, our missions, I think there's always a trade-off between the access that our legitimate or real operational mission gives us, and then to what degree are we going to leverage that access for other things such as intelligence collection purposes or whatever the case may be. And so, kind of to take it up to a strategic type of level, we know that our adversaries collect intelligence on us. Our adversaries know that we collect intelligence on them. In fact, we kind of appreciate the fact that they're able to do that, and they appreciate it as well. There's no international law prohibiting espionage. If a U.S. citizen gets arrested for supporting the Soviet or providing intelligence to the Soviet Union or the Russians, we don't charge the Russians with espionage. We don't charge the KGB guy who was running the SVR guy who was running the operation out of the embassy. We charge the individual with espionage. And we in fact, and we're going to get somewhere with this, but in fact, we even give our adversaries the access that they need to collect intelligence against us. And we like the fact that they're able to do that because they're able to confirm that what we're telling them is the truth, that we have no malintent, and they accept that as well. So they give us the access that we need to collect intelligence operations, and we give them the access. And so, it's all a trade-off, and everybody understands that that's how we do business. So, it's, and I know that when I went to the Army Special Operations Command way back in the day, I had this discussion, and I knew that there was a lot of sensitivities. General Downing was the commander at the time, and intelligence was kind of a dirty, nasty stain term back then. I knew there was a lot of sensitivities regarding, how we leverage our access to a certain country for other means. And so I'm not going to get into that discussion today, but I will just say that the history demonstrates that our adversaries, the Chinese, the Russians, everybody, they exploit whatever access that they have to collect intelligence or conduct covert operations, or whatever the case may be, very aggressively. And perhaps we don't do, as well on those type of things. And again, the MLMs were a perfect example of the decision to, you have a legitimate liaison mission, but now we're going to use that mission as our access into the occupied sectors to collect intelligence.
Now, kind of to continue with that theme, one of the things we do here at JSOU, since we are a practitioner institution, and so our scholarship, our courses and stuff is focused on how to take theory and history and leverage it for the practitioner. Is there any general comments or observations you have on about the utility of history, and especially this time period, the Cold War, and in thinking about today. As you mentioned, you think of some of the language we use. We talk gray zone, we talk deterrence, we're talking strategic competition now. So, any thoughts that you have, even beyond the book, about utilizing history to think about today, that would be useful for the practitioner?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you obviously you see I have some ideas on some very certain areas, but I think that we could look at the Soviet model during the Cold War as how do you do integrated deterrence type of activities, and that's kind of the problem that we have to overcome, because it's the U.S. kind of way of doing business. We like to do things in a decentralized manner. We like to empower our leaders at the lower level, and so we have a problem with kind of central coordination of our activities, where the Soviets, and any autocratic country, and you probably read, there are many studies that will tell you, there are some advantages to being a autocratic country, because you can manage these type of things a little better. You have more central decision making that enables more centralized operations. So that's kind of the thing that we know that we don't want to get there. So we got to figure out how can we do things better, as an interagency within the DoD. Now, I've been very glad to see, I think General Clark was kind of one of the leaders on this before he departed, but the soft cyber space triad, talking about how we integrate those type of things. And I think counterintelligence probably has a piece to play there. But those elements that are operating in the gray area, that are operating during phase 0, during early phase 1 of an operation, how do we integrate those activities? Because and I'll go back to counterintelligence, like we would have learned during the Cold War. Once the fighting starts, counterintelligence isn't going to do you any good. But if counterintelligence had done a good job during that gray zone, during that phase 0, setting the preconditions for it, that could have determined how that war was going to go. And I think that as we look at soft cyber space triad and how they kind of operate in that gray zone and together to kind of shape and set the conditions for successful operations, if we do get to that point, I think that there's a lot to be learned about how we probably didn't do it the right way, and how other forces have done it in what we should kind of look at as a very well centrally orchestrated manner. And you're probably, Dave, the better expert on this as to how we get to a solution. I mean, I don't know if it's an element within the NSC that can do a better job of coordinating all the cats and dogs, or from the DoD perspective, I think it's a little easier to do, although we do have still a geographically oriented mindset, where I think we're starting to see with globally integrated exercises and globally integrated war plans that no combatant command is going to fight a war on its own again, that it's going to be a fully integrated operation, and strategic deterrence is the beginning of setting the preconditions for it never happening, and then how we operate in the gray zone and that nature.
No, I think it's an important, topic about how do we, collaboration and interagency integration. And I think theoretically it seems simple, right? I mean, we should all want our government to work together. But I think when we start thinking about issues like, what was the purpose behind those organizations being set up in the first place? How do we fund different organizations? It starts to become much more complicated, especially if it's hard to break individuals away from their individual interest, let alone their institutional interest. And so it's very tough. On the positive side, at least in from my take on history and then my own personal experience, I think we came a long way in the last 20 years. It's not perfect, but I think if you look to see, take the relationship between that, I know a little bit about it, between DoD and CIA, it's much better than like you mentioned, the time frame that you had identified during the Cold War. And so I think that we've made positive steps, improvement, but we have a ways to go, especially I think now with strategic competition, it's at a level that we've never experienced before. and we're going to be utilizing capabilities within DoD and elsewhere in ways that we've never thought about before.
Yeah, and I agree. And if we've made that progress, let's hope that everybody agrees that let's not go back to where we were before.
No, I agree with that. We have a couple questions from the audience. And so the first question, they wanted to thank you for your service, first of all, Aden. And their question is, how has Russia changed the gray zone conflict in the last 10 years? I know that's a little bit out of the scope of your book, but I know from a practitioner side that you've probably been thinking about this.
Yeah, well, I think they're probably the example to study if you want to look at gray zone operations. And I'll take it back to my kind of discussion about their mentality and how they look at the world differently than we do. And I probably should have continued that conversation about the Russian mentality to say that what we've seen over the past 2 years is simply a reflection of that. Now, we don't know what goes on inside that Putin head of his, but everything that we've seen play out feeds right into that mentality, that national mentality that, okay, if we don't establish a bigger buffer between us and NATO, that's just going to enable NATO to be that next empire to come in and crush us. And then, of course, their whole intent was to drive a wedge between NATO. So, you would consider that kind of a, using a red zone operation to enable a gray zone operation. But yeah, as far as that goes, I think that Russia has probably been the example for how to do things. They went into their invasion against Ukraine with a false flag, under the pretenses that they were liberating the ethnic Russians, when we all actually know exactly, what they were doing. And we don't know if they were saying that more for domestic consumption than they were international consumption. But yeah, they definitely, when you started to see Ukraine ramp up and we saw that it was, you could definitely see the different vehicles of information, disinformation, propaganda, how they were already starting to fight the information operation aspect of that war before the bullets started firing.
Now, one of the interesting things along that topic, I think a lot of times, and this is why I think history is important, we tend to forget. We have historical amnesia, right? And we forget some of the stuff that we have done in the past. And I think the Cold War is a perfect example. While I'm not saying today is exactly like the Cold War, if you see some of the, covert actions that were undertaken in the Cold War, if you look at, Wisner, for example, from the CIA, and some of the activities that they did, it's there's a little rhyming, there's some similarity. And so, whenever we take this gray zone or whatever as something novel, I think we forget and ignore some of the history that we have, and some of the things that you've highlighted that the Soviets did. There's some connections to how they approach today.
Yeah, and I agree. And even though during the Cold War there was the line that demarked the blue zone from the red zone, it was really all just fought as one big gray zone, in my opinion. So again, there are certainly lessons to be learned, lessons that I probably didn't capture. But again, I think if we're looking towards the future, that's a great thing to study from that perspective.
So we got another question, and this one is more of a historical question, focused on the Stasi. And so I'll just read it verbatim. Whilst there has been a peaceful unification of the two Germanys, what about the Stasi operatives carrying out their SOPs from the Cold War? And in your view, have they been de-radicalized or de-Stasi'd? I take that about a continuing influence of East Germany on West Germany. Do you see anything?
No, I haven't seen anything. In fact, most of the Stasi members that knew that they had blood on their hands got out when they could. The Germans were pretty forthcoming with opening their files. I'm not an expert on the area, but again, we've spoken with old MLM types through the research of the book, but I haven't seen anything as a issue with old Stasis forming a shadow government in Germany and trying to do anything like that. But maybe it's occurring and I just haven't seen it, but I've seen no indications of that.
Okay.
But I will tell you that when the Stasi files did come open. I mean, some of the nastiness and the things they were doing that we had absolutely no idea. I mean, it was amazing that they were definitely, that when I say the Stasi, I'm saying the entire Soviet bloc, Soviet Union, they were playing the game of chess at a completely different level than they were. Now, some of it you could say at a high level, and some you could say at a very low level for some of the wet op stuff, kind of stuff that they were doing. But they were definitely in it to win it.
We're coming up on the hour. What I'd like to do with the last question is just, give you some open space to just any last parting thoughts that you have on either the book or any of the topics that we touched upon today.
Yeah, I would say one piece that, and I'm sorry if I was, if anybody out there took me as being terribly critical of the interagencies, the CIA, but that was kind of, my perspective on, and again, that was ancient history, and I'm looking at it from a history standpoint. But one thing that really, I will say, if you want to bring out something that really hurt as far as the lack of an interagency cooperation, and I just missed on the point when I talked about this, is if there had have been a better collaboration amongst the CIA and the DOD, we probably would have improved on things. So the USER kind of looked at the agreement on the MLMs as a DOD agreement. And so, and the State Department agreed, the State Department didn't get involved in that. So the CIA basically looked at themselves as not having jurisdiction, and the DOD wanted to keep them out of that because basically they didn't want anybody messing with the MLMs in a way that might have a negative impact on their collection mission in the East. But, and we talked about the decentralized nature of CIA and so, of the CI structure and some of the issues that had. But had we had that big brother perspective relationship during the time, the CIA is the element that would have been able to look at the DOD's problem and say, and from a global perspective and say, hey, look, you guys, you're mirror imaging. You're looking at your Soviet Military Liaison Mission and thinking that they're operating like your guys are, going all over the countryside and collecting. Whereas the CIA probably could have given DOD, Army CI that perspective of, hey, look, the Soviets don't use any of their accesses, any of their platforms in Western country. I mean, they are always going to exploit those for clandestine UMET operations and covert action. So you guys are kidding yourself if you think these guys are just taking leisurely travels to the Frankfurt area that you don't know about. And so that's when finally, at the starting in the 1980s, we started to realize, and there was a high-level defector to the Brits who identified, yes, they're operating as GRU platforms, conducting clandestine UMET operations, and we confirmed that there were 2 walk-ins during a certain 4-year period, an NCO and a major who provided information. So we were very slow to learn to understand that that was probably a GRU collection platform, and we were just thinking, oh, they're just out collecting UMET on bumpers on convoys and things like that. So I think that is an area where that lack of collaboration, really hurt us there. And once again, a good example of if we were able to share that kind of strategic view, it really would have helped us focus on that target much earlier than we did. And by the time, I got involved in that, the Cold War clock was ticking, and, we missed that opportunity to really crack that nut.
Thanks, Ed. We have another question. Who did the U.S. MLM actually report to? What was the most dangerous mission that Mr. Magee uncovered?
Yeah, well, for the U.S. MLMs, they reported to the USER G2, and that's why, that's, again, if the USER G2, if that is their best source of intel, and we know that if keeping our hands off of the U.S., the SMLMF, from the CI perspective, is going to keep them from interfering in our collection operations, where that kind of balance is going to lie. So I think that had a lot to do with the institutional inertia to not really look at the SMLMF problem hard during the early days, because the MLM missions were so effective. From my understanding of the MLMs, now there may be stuff that they weren't able or willing to tell me, but they were purely overt UMET collection. That's what they did. They would go out try to get close to a target, take pictures. It was basically a general rule that they would not violate PRAs or permanent restricted areas, because if they did violate those restricted areas, they would be PNG'd out. So both sides did take that very seriously. Now, obviously, there were some cases where they were sent into PRAs on a mission, but as far as dangerous missions, I'm not really clear on that. I do know that they had a relationship with our SOF element in Berlin, Det A, and sometimes that they would look for recon targets that were in the Det A's. Det A was the SOF element that was going to be the stay behind when the Russians invaded and took over Berlin, and they would support some of their those SOF missions as well. And maybe that's what someone in your audience with a SOF perspective is asking. But as far as just purely dangerous, die in place type missions, I'm not aware of any.
Aden, thank you for joining us today. Recommend to the audience reading your book. I think it's especially today as we talk about strategic competition, integrated deterrence. I think there's value for the practitioner to read the book, to understand the context of the strategic context at the time, and to think about ways maybe it's applicable today. Like any history, it's a product of its own time, of course. But there is value for the practitioner to read and reflect on it. So thank you very much for joining today. Highly recommend the book. It looks at a very important, interesting, and unique organization that there's a big gap in the literature, and you fill a good portion of that gap. And so thank you for your contribution.
All right, Dave, thanks for having me. And if there's anybody that is interested in a follow-on dialogue or conversation about anything that we discussed here, I think that Clarissa is going to put up some contact information, or otherwise you can reach me through, I guess, JSOU, and I'd be glad to continue the dialogue with anybody that's willing to have it.
Thank you, Aden. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. Have a great day. Hope to see you next time on ThinkJSOU.